My mother married me off to a wealthy second-generation man with disabled legs. On our wedding day, I carefully asked him, "Do you need me to carry you to bed?" He smiled nonchalantly. "Thank you for the trouble." I rolled up my sleeves to lift him, but I didn't stand steady, and we both fell to the ground. I nearly inherited a fortune worth hundreds of millions after graduating from college. My mom sold me to a rich man for a dowry of tens of millions. I heard he was a typical rich successor. A mishap had crippled his legs and also cost him his family's inheritance rights. Now, he was wealthy and idle, but my mom was worried. I heard it's not just his legs, he's also impotent. That caught my attention. Perfect, rich and prestigious, a crippled husband who's impotent. What could be happier? So, I split the dowry with my mom and married him joyfully. Why marry a cripple? Because of the money. What a vulgar and mercenary reason. On the day of the wedding, I was still a bit nervous. He needed a non-influential trophy wife, and my mom and I, greedy for wealth, were a perfect match. In fact, we only met for the first time on the wedding day. Before the ceremony, my mom shoved me into his resting room, supposedly to foster some affection, with only 10 minutes left before going on stage. What affection was there to foster? Holding up the hem of my wedding gown, I walked in, thinking about how to greet him, but I was stunned. Wasn't he supposed to be a pitiful man? Crippled and impotent, who was this man in the wheelchair? A well-tailored black suit, casually unbuttoned at the top despite it being his wedding. Even seated in a wheelchair, his spine was still impressively straight, noble, and indifferent. Looking up further, his face was astonishing. No words could do justice to his looks. My hand loosened, and I tripped over the hem of my gown, ending up in an awkward kneel before him. I looked up and stammered, I say I walked into the wrong room. Do you believe me? After I entered, he had sized me up a few times. Now, he sat in his wheelchair and I knelt in disarray. As his gaze finally settled on the wedding gown he had someone send over. I guess, he's only crippled, not foolish. To ease the awkwardness, I quickly stood up, only to speak honestly. My mom sent me to foster some affection with you. The man chuckled softly. He glanced at his watch. 5 minutes of fostering should be enough for the wedding. Thinking of him as the financier, I carefully inquired, "Is there anything I should pay attention to during the wedding?" Inside, I was screaming, "Give me some demands or conditions and then raise the price." However, he glanced at me, casually loosened his tie, and said indifferently, "No need, just quietly be a vase." "Oh, okay," I tactfully responded and stood aside, saying no more. His gaze always seemed to drift uncontrollably towards him. I am shallow, and I am at fault. I regret the inhumane pleasure I once found in his presence. Such a heavenly face. What a pity. The wedding concluded perfectly. A vase, simplicity itself. All I needed to do was stand up straight, tuck in my stomach, lift my buttocks, smile, and endure under the spotlight until the ceremony was over. Frank seemed quite pleased with my performance. After the wedding, slightly tipsy, he slipped a bank card into my arms. No explanation, no specified amount, but from his demeanor, it seemed intended as a reward. Being from the wealthy Smith family, he wouldn't be stingy. I secured the card carefully, and only after a while did I remember to ask for the PIN. Along with the bank card, he also tossed me a set of keys and a note with an address and phone number. He took a private car and left, telling me to cab back home. I had no intention of returning to Master Frank's mansion with the bank card. I immediately went to a nearby bank. As I checked the balance at the ATM, my hands trembled with anticipation. However, bank account balance, $100. I stared at the screen for a long time until an annoyed man behind me urged, "Miss, you're hesitating over $100. Want me to light it up for you before you withdraw?" Embarrassed, I took the card out, not ready to give up, and went to the counter to check. Indeed, it was just $100. He's got some nerve. It's not like I have any real feelings, but after all, I married him in an elaborate wedding dress. $100. Is he treating me like a beggar? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I withdrew the $100 and used his money to hail 3 taxis. I rode in one, and the other 2 followed empty. However, that was a mistake. I hadn't realized just how far away Master Frank's mansion was, and the 3 taxis ended up costing over $400. The 100 was gone, and I was down an additional $300. Such bad luck. Later that night, our wedding night, I sat on the sofa, staring at Frank's handsome face, feeling nothing but anger. As I was internally ranting about him, Frank suddenly looked over. Sarah, me answer, yes, it's me. Instantly cowed at the sight of my benefactor, Frank's gaze rested on my face, light yet piercingly intense. Our eyes met, and he slightly curled his lips, softly saying, "It's time to sleep." My face flushed involuntarily, but then I remembered my mother's words. And a cold splash of reality hit me. I glanced at his long legs resting on the wheelchair, cautiously asking, "Do you need me to carry you to bed?" After a pause, I licked my lips and added, "I'm quite strong." Frank, sitting in his wheelchair, unbuttoned 2 buttons leisurely and smiled nonchalantly. "Thank you for the trouble." I walked over, crouched in front of him with my back to him. 2 seconds later, Frank leaned slightly forward, his hands naturally resting on my shoulders. His arms were long, loosely draped in front of my neck, and he smelled good, a fresh scent, like pine. My intention was simple, just to make a good impression on my benefactor, yet, when he really leaned on my shoulder, the close contact instantly made my face turn red. At that moment, he had taken off his suit jacket, wearing only a white shirt, while I had changed out of my wedding dress into a thin toast dress. The moment I carried him on my back, I could even feel Frank's body temperature. Thinking about it made my heart flutter. A misstep, and I stepped on the trailing hem of my dress. Carrying Frank, I fell flat on the ground. I lay there, not daring to get up. I assure myself that I am not a comedic woman, having been quite clever and quick-witted for the first 20-something years of my life. I don't know what's wrong today. Falling once is bad enough, but even dropping my sponsor too, for a long while. I didn't hear any movement from Frank. Suddenly, I panicked a bit. Could it be? He fainted. Just as I was about to look up, I suddenly heard Frank's voice, hoarse, deep, "Come here." I got up and walked over cautiously, then crouched down. I tried to explain, but before I could gather my words, my wrist was suddenly gripped tightly. Frank clenched my wrist, yanked hard, and I fell into his arms. The floor was cold. Frank lay on his back, holding my hand tightly, his eyes scrutinizing me lying on top of him, up close. This man was still devastatingly handsome. "Sarah," he looked at me without blinking, gritting his teeth, "help me to my wheelchair. I can get into bed myself." "Oh, okay." Frank's gaze was too intense. I couldn't meet his eyes and helped him up while looking away, however. The fall had been quite severe. The wheelchair was a few steps away. Thinking of Master Frank's disability and inability to stand, I helped him sit back down on the floor. "Please sit here for a while, I'll get the wheelchair." Frank didn't speak, but his eyes darkened a bit. I guessed he might be regretting that even if buying a vase, he should have bought a smart one. To make amends, I ran to fetch the wheelchair. When I reached out to help him again, Frank didn't move. What, is he sulking now? I looked down at him, only to see him sigh heavily, his voice hoarse. "You're standing on my foot." "Sorry." To compensate, I exerted all my strength and carefully lifted him into the wheelchair. But Master Frank seemed unsatisfied, his lips tightly pursed, his ears reddening. He almost bit his teeth as he spoke. "Sarah, I asked you to help me, not to carry me, such a difficult person to please." I responded and pushed the wheelchair to the bed, curious to see how he would manage to get onto it. But then his voice came slightly lowered. "Turn around." I obediently did so, but there happened to be a small mirror on the table opposite, and in the reflection, I clearly saw Frank sitting in the wheelchair, pushing against the bed with both hands. Then a thud, he had fallen down. The atmosphere turned a bit awkward. I stood with my back to him. It was a predicament whether to turn around or not. As I hesitated, I suddenly heard his low voice from behind, sounding rather annoyed and somewhat frustrated. "What are you still standing there for?" "Oh." I quickly turned around. Frank was sitting on the floor, his legs looking weak, his lips tightly pursed, and his ears conspicuously red. It was probably the embarrassment from falling twice that hurt his pride. To help him up, I placed his arm over my shoulder and comforted him gently as I supported him to his feet. "Master Fu, don't take it to heart. If I were disabled, I might not even manage to wipe my own butt when using the restroom, let alone." I stopped mid-sentence as Frank tightened his grip on my shoulder. "Shut up." "All right." With that, I helped Frank into bed and then received his command. "From now on, when you accompany me out, just smile and keep your mouth shut." All right. Since he was paying, I was following orders. If he preferred me silent, I could even drink water through my nose. On our wedding night, I had intended to sleep on a makeshift bed on the floor, but Frank wouldn't allow it. He insisted I sleep beside him under the same blanket. I was actually willing, but still feigned shyness and hesitated, blushing and saying, "Isn't that inappropriate?" When he suddenly handed me a bank card, I paused for a moment. "Another $100, 200,000, deal, husband." I snatched the card from him, grinning as I accepted it. The night was peaceful, though a bit cold. That scoundrel had rolled all the blankets over to his side in the middle of the night, and I ended up so cold I couldn't stand it. I had to snuggle close to him to sleep, barely covering myself with half the blanket. I vaguely remember, his body was exceptionally warm, like being next to a furnace. When I woke up the next day, Frank was already sitting in a wheelchair. I had no idea how he managed to get into it. The wheelchair was right beside the bed, and Frank was deeply engrossed in a book. The sunlight outside cast a golden hue around his eyes and brows. He looked stunningly handsome. As I stared mesmerized, Frank suddenly turned his head to look at me. "Come downstairs, it's time to eat," I responded, and noticed dark circles under Frank's eyes. Had he not slept well last night? He seemed to have slept soundly, hogging the blankets all to himself. Frank put down the book, maneuvered his wheelchair, and left the room. I quickly got out of bed to wash up and inadvertently glanced at the book Frank had been reading, which made me pause. Grimm's Fairy Tales. It turns out, even noble young masters have a childlike spirit. After breakfast, Frank left the house. Before leaving, he instructed me to be dressed and ready by 7 p.m. to wait for him at home, as he was taking me to the Smith family's banquet tonight. I obediently agreed. The Smith family's banquet was not to be taken lightly, moreover. Since I married Frank yesterday, celebrities and businessmen from all sectors came to congratulate us, yet the Smith family was conspicuously absent. However, Frank seemed not to care much about the situation. I didn't need to work, and staying in the empty mansion was boring, so I hailed a taxi and went out for a stroll. Frank's garage was full of dusty luxury cars, but he hadn't left a driver for me, and I didn't even have a driver's license, with my bank card in hand. I took a taxi to the most upscale shopping mall in the city. The mall was crowded, but most people were like me, just looking without buying. After all, spending hundreds of thousands here was not something ordinary people could afford. I walked around and ended up with nothing in my hands. Suddenly, my stomach started to hurt terribly. Remembering I had some paper in my bag, I turned around and headed to the public restroom. However, possibly because it was the weekend and the mall was very crowded, there was a long line at the women's restroom, while the men's was empty. My stomach hurt too much, and I couldn't bear it, so I quietly sneaked into the men's restroom. I locked the door and squatted down. Just as I was pulling up my pants and flushing, someone knocked twice on the partition, followed by a deep male voice from the next stall. "Excuse me, could I borrow some paper?" His voice was deep and magnetic, slightly hoarse. It sounded incredibly attractive. I hurriedly pulled out the remaining paper from my bag, not looking, and passed it over. However, a few seconds later, it was pushed back. "Using this isn't appropriate, right? Do you have paper?" I was confused. Then I looked down. Deadly mistake. The item that was pushed back to me was a sanitary pad from my bag. Blushing, I quickly pulled out some tissue paper and stuffed it under the stall. "Sorry, I grabbed the wrong thing." It took him a few seconds to respond, his tone slightly raised. "A girl." That's when I remembered I was in the men's restroom. I didn't dare respond and quickly turned around and ran out. At 7 in the evening, when Frank came home, I was already dressed in an elegant gown, sitting on the sofa with my makeup perfectly done. As soon as I saw the silhouette of him in his wheelchair, I rushed over, lifting my skirt as if to show off. "Does it look good?" I admit sometimes I'm absent-minded and misspeak, but I haven't really messed up when it comes to beautifying myself. From high-end banquets to dancing in bars, my outfits never miss the mark. Frank's gaze lingered on me for a good 6 or 7 seconds before he lightly shifted his eyes away and casually remarked, "It's all right." What did he mean by, "it's all right"? He clearly avoided looking directly at me, being his benefactor, of course. I wouldn't call him out, so I volunteered to replace Frank's assistant, pushing his wheelchair out the door. We left the house and got into the car. Frank's mansion wasn't too far from the Smith family, about a 20-minute drive. On the way, Frank remained silent, but I noticed his expression growing darker. It seems, the rumors are true about Frank's relationship with the Smith family. It really seemed like things had become quite tense. This was the Smith family. I stood at the entrance, paused, and looked around. It wasn't some luxurious villa, but a manor. At first glance, it seemed endless. After a few looks, I diverted my gaze and turned to help Frank with his wheelchair. With Frank as a living signboard, we progressed smoothly. When I almost got lost, the butler led us to a building and opened the door. I pushed Frank inside. The banquet hall was vast, with only a few dozen people scattered around. The moment we entered, almost everyone's gaze fell on us, with a smile. I confidently pushed Frank further into the room. We made our way to the main hall, where a man and a woman stood. The man was in a well-tailored suit, standing tall and straight. The woman leaned on him, her red dress highlighting her graceful figure. It was clear they were the hosts. Sure enough, after approaching, Frank paused for 2 seconds and then deeply called out, "Brother." My guess was right. The man was Francis, the heir to the Smith family. Francis nodded slightly, his gaze sweeping past Frank and landing on me. His look was piercing, unlike Frank's indifference and casual demeanor. Instead, it was more invasive and sharp. It was intimidating, suppressing my nervousness. I also called out, "Brother," following Frank. However, hearing my voice, Francis slightly raised his eyebrows, a hint of surprise flickering in his deep eyes. The next moment, his gaze moved from my face and lightly rested on my wrist. I was puzzled and looked down as well, on my right wrist. I wore a silver bracelet that I always kept on. It matched my outfit today, so I hadn't taken it off. Still confused, I looked up only to find Francis had shifted his gaze away. His previous stare seemed almost like my imagination. The oppressive aura he emitted was strong, but fortunately, he didn't linger long. After a brief and indifferent conversation with Frank, he got up and moved to another part of the room. Frank didn't seem to enjoy socializing much. He asked me to push him to a corner where he sat quietly in his wheelchair. His gaze casually swept over person after person, yet he remained silent. After a while, I felt a bit bored and suggested we go to the restroom. Frank nodded without a word. In the hallway, seeing that no one was around, I pulled out a cigarette from the decorative bag I was carrying. Saying I was going to the restroom was actually just an excuse for a smoke break. However, just as I lit the cigarette, I heard footsteps behind me. As I fumbled to put out the cigarette, a somewhat familiar voice came from behind. "Don't bother putting it out. Give me one." I moved my hand with the cigarette behind my back and turned around. It was Francis. He walked up to 2 steps away from me, stopped, and with his palm facing up, gestured for a cigarette. I hesitated for a moment, then said, "This cigarette is cheap and a bit harsh." "It's fine." Francis curled his lip into a smile. "Just perfect." With the conversation at that point, I had no choice but to open the pack and pull out another cigarette for him. Francis took the cigarette and lighter, lighting it up. As he exhaled the smoke, he turned to look at me. "Don't recognize me, huh?" I was a bit confused, but still managed a sheepish reply. "I recognize you. You're Frank's brother." "No, I'm not." Francis took another drag, his profile looking quite striking. "Thanks for the paper this afternoon. It was you," I exclaimed in surprise, still unable to digest the situation, when suddenly a figure in a wheelchair appeared around the corner. Frank was wheeling himself towards us, lifting his eyelids nonchalantly as he eyed me. "What's with him?" I remained silent, unable to answer. Meanwhile, Francis, with a cigarette between his fingers, looked calm and indifferent. Under Frank's gaze, he even took another drag. He clearly had no intention of answering Frank's question. I was in a quandary. How could I explain? Should I say I spent the afternoon wandering around a high-end mall, went to the men's restroom, and ended up passing a sanitary pad to the guy in the next stall? That would just make me look foolish. While I hesitated, Frank spoke again. "Let's go." With that, he turned his wheelchair and started to leave. I hurriedly followed him, passing by Francis, who suddenly spoke. His voice was deep. "Nice cigarette. Thank you." After those baffling exchanges, I dashed out and took the initiative to push Frank's wheelchair. I'm not foolish. I know who my real benefactor is. Even though Francis is much wealthier than his brother, it seems the Smith family has many members. What they call a family dinner feels more like a high society cocktail party. I stood behind Frank, hands on the wheelchair, smiling at everyone who passed by. However, despite the many people coming and going, not a single one stopped to greet Frank, it seemed. Not only had Frank lost his position as heir, but his status within the family was also pitifully low. Thinking this, I felt a bit of sympathy for him. Yet Frank seemed not to mind at all, rather enjoying the peace. He reached out, picked up a pastry from a nearby table. Holding the pastry in his left hand, he gestured to me with his right. "Come here." I obediently leaned over, and he pinched my cheek, then stuffed the delicate pastry into my mouth. A gentle sweetness spread through my lips and teeth. Frank clapped his hands, casually brushing off the crumbs stuck to his fingers. "How does it taste?" "Delicious," Frank nodded. "Pack some to take with you later." I was taken aback, suddenly recalling the scene from my childhood in the countryside, where aunties packed roasted chickens in plastic bags at banquets. Coming back to my senses, I quietly tightened my grip on the wheelchair handles. It seems that young Master Frank indeed holds a very low status in the Smith family. I used to read a lot of domineering CEO stories where the young masters would always generously offer to prepare extra portions of the dishes their companions liked. Poor our young Master Frank, he would grandly gesture to pack and take away the food. The family banquet was relatively calm, however. While Frank's side was quiet, the area around Francis was bustling with people, making it incredibly lively. I couldn't help but take a few more glances, but the people around Francis seemed to be getting the cold shoulder from him. Standing alone, his expression was indifferent. Apart from the lady by his side, he barely spoke to anyone else. Even though it was a so-called family banquet, there was a clear hierarchy in place. Bored with watching, I turned my gaze away, ready to chat with Frank. Just as I looked down, I caught Frank looking towards a distant part of the crowd. However, he didn't seem to be looking at Francis, but rather at the woman next to him. If I'm not mistaken, she must be his future sister-in-law. Having known Frank for 2 days, his gaze always seemed distant, as if nothing in the world could pique his interest. I often thought to myself how he had the perfect face for world weariness, yet the way he just looked at that woman was distinctly fervent. It appears that Frank's feelings for his prospective sister-in-law are not ordinary. When Frank looked away, I also turned my head aside. As a perfect vase, an attractive but superficial person, I know better than anyone not to guess the thoughts of my benefactor. Guessing too much could cost me my job. I thought I just needed to stay out of the way with Frank until the banquet was over, but trouble still found me. Halfway through the banquet, a woman in a black evening dress approached us, looking to be in her mid-20s. Before she even spoke, her sharp features told me she was not someone to be trifled with. Though beautiful, her face carried a look of harshness. Sure enough, the woman walked over, her gaze sweeping over Frank's face in a mocking tone. "Frank, how is your leg treatment going? I heard from Big Brother that you might never stand up again. Don't be discouraged, perhaps miracles do exist in this world." Her tone was less like that of a noble lady and more like a village gossip. What was Frank's reaction? He had none. He didn't even spare her a glance, letting her bark on the side while remaining utterly composed. But she was not willing to give up. She casually picked up 2 glasses of wine from nearby and handed one to Frank. "I missed your wedding because I was busy. Come on, let's have a drink to celebrate, even though it's late." However, Frank did not accept it. The woman's hand, holding the glass, froze mid-air, making the situation somewhat awkward. After a pause, she turned to look at me, the glass she couldn't pass to him, she then offered to me. I looked at Frank, noticing my gaze. Frank spoke indifferently, not sparing her any face. "Fiona, the adopted daughter of Mr. Smith." I heard it and felt a bit awkward. Is this really something you can talk about? Just by looking at Frank's expression, I knew he must have rejected her mercilessly. No wonder Fiona was acting so odd earlier. It turns out it was a case of deep love, met with deep resentment. Fiona had been holding her drink for quite some time, and people had started to notice our situation. Seeing that Frank did not intend to stop her, I reached out to take the drink. Even though she is an adopted daughter, she is still the young lady of the Smith family. When the young lady offers a toast, there's no reason for me not to accept. However, the moment I grabbed the glass, Fiona let go prematurely. I couldn't react in time, and the glass fell onto Frank. The red wine soaked his suit, and the white shirt underneath was stained with a deep red. It was exceptionally embarrassing. The glass rolled off Frank and shattered on the floor. With a crisp sound, the glass broke, and the shards splashed onto my feet, causing a sharp pain. Fiona's face changed instantly, and with a frown, she sharply questioned me. "I offered you a drink out of respect for Frank. If you didn't want to drink, that's fine, but what's the meaning of smashing the glass?" after successfully attracting everyone's attention, she added another statement to elevate the significance of this little incident. If you have any complaints about people not attending the wedding, just say it outright. But this is the Smith family's house party. Are you trying to challenge the Smith family by smashing a glass in public? I frowned at her. She really knew how to put a tall hat on me. I wanted to retort but kept in mind Frank's presence. I glanced at him. He still had that indifferent expression, but, when I looked at him, he slightly raised his eyebrows. I wasn't sure if I misunderstood, but I took it as a sign to go ahead. Miss Fiona, you don't need to accuse me of challenging the Smith family. It's my first time entering the Smith household, and I respect the family's rules. I certainly didn't intend to cause trouble. It was indeed an accident, but if you are looking for an excuse, perhaps it's because I simply don't like you. After saying this, I pretended to be shocked and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the hall to hear. But surely, Miss Fiona, you don't think I hold a grudge because you once confessed to my husband in private, do you? As my words hung in the air, I suddenly covered my mouth. Is this something one can say? Fiona's face turned from green to white. What nonsense are you talking about? Frank is my brother. How could I possibly confess to him? Besides, he's just a cripple. What's there for him? She was extremely angry, indicating that her private confession to Frank was indeed something she couldn't discuss openly. After all, they were both publicly acknowledged as children of the Smith family. I shrugged and looked at Frank with an innocent expression. Frank, did I speak nonsense? Frank didn't look at me, but the corners of his lips clearly curled up a bit. It was as if he was smiling. Fortunately, Frank supported me very effectively. He spoke softly yet affirmatively. No, those two words made Frank's stance clear. At the same time, he turned to look at me, speaking in a tone meant for me. Her indifferent voice carried through the banquet hall, reaching everyone's ears. The confession video is still there. If you're interested, I can show it to you later. I looked at Fiona's face, smiling as I responded, sure, I'm quite curious to see what it's like to confess to one's own brother. Miss Fiona, you truly are open-minded after studying abroad. Fiona, whose secret had been exposed, could no longer hold back. We were only a step or two apart when she suddenly stepped forward, raising her hand to slap me. Her hand came down hard but missed me, one tall, one short. Two hands tightly grasped Fiona's wrist as she swung. A few seconds of silence followed. Then a collective gasp from the crowd. One hand belonged to Frank. He sat in his wheelchair, his arms slightly raised, stopping Fiona. The other hand, which caused the crowd's astonishment, belonged to Francis. Since entering the banquet hall, Francis had been aloof, automatically ignoring all greetings. He gripped Fiona's wrist, his voice cold and harsh. What are you doing? 4 words, spoken with reprimand, instantly silenced Fiona. The Fiona who had been sarcastic towards Frank was now completely subdued, not even daring to breathe heavily. Francis said nothing more, or rather, given his status, those 4 words were enough. His gaze swept past Fiona, paused briefly on my face, then he turned and left. The woman in the red dress who stood next to Francis, however, came over, unlike Fiona's arrogance and haughtiness. She first nodded to Frank, then turned to me. Her delicate, pale hand reached out to me. Hello, I'm Francis's fiancée, Wendy. I quickly shook her hand. Wendy, such a simple yet elegant name, yet she was strikingly glamorous. Her makeup was impeccable, and her smile almost mesmerized me. She was the type of woman who could turn heads. No wonder she stood by Francis's side. After a brief conversation, Wendy also left, and I noticed that Frank's gaze had been fixed on his future sister-in-law the entire time. He never looked away. I hadn't realized how deeply infatuated he was. After Wendy left, Frank remained silent but began to have me fetch him drinks, one after another. His brow was furrowed, seemingly burdened with heavy thoughts. Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore and softly reminded him that drinking too much was harmful and that he should drink in moderation. However, Frank glanced at me, fumbled in his pocket for a moment, and handed me a card. Shut up. I stared at the card for a couple of seconds, about to ask how much money it contained when Frank spoke. 50,000, no pin. Very well, young master. I took the card and immediately kept quiet, examining the card repeatedly in my hand, and couldn't help but think, could this man be involved in some shady card dealings? How can one always pull out a card of varying amounts at any given moment, after much anticipation and endurance? The family banquet finally concluded. I breathed a sigh of relief and pushed Frank out of the Smith residence. Once inside the car, Frank removed his suit jacket, pinched the bridge of his nose, and leaned back in his seat with his eyes closed. Sarah, yes, I quickly leaned in closer to him. However, just as the car turned a corner, I wasn't seated securely and ended up tumbling into Frank's arms, oddly enough. The moment I collided with him, I instinctively reached out my hand. And though it was through his shirt, it seemed like I touched his abdominal muscles. They felt firm and were distinctly outlined. I was puzzled, wondering how he managed to maintain such muscles. Was he lifting weights while sitting in a wheelchair? Lost in thought, I heard Frank's voice above me. Have you felt enough? I snapped back to reality, withdrew my hand, and sat back properly. With an awkward laugh, I tried to explain. The car just turned sharply, and I lost my balance. Frank responded nonchalantly and then opened his eyes to look at the driver in the front seat. Next month, you'll get a raise. The driver thanked him profusely, his smile almost reaching his ears, yet without a sound. After the raise episode, I quietly asked him what he needed me for earlier. Frank turned his head to look at me and mysteriously produced a beautifully crafted bag, handing it over to me. Upon opening it, it was some of the pastries from earlier, neatly packed. He had remembered. I was stunned for a second before taking it from him. The Smith family's private chef was skilled, and this particular almond-flavored pastry was delicious, sweet but not overly so. I couldn't resist and pinched off a piece to bring to Frank's lips. Try some. Frank glanced down and modestly accepted it, taking a bite. The second night we shared a bed, it was I who helped Frank onto it. Before getting into bed, a personal assistant helped Frank bathe, and by the time he came out of the bathroom, he was dressed in a set of black silk pajamas, matching the set I was wearing. They were couple's pajamas. Only a nightlight was on in the room. I rushed to push his wheelchair, forgetting to even put on shoes. My bare feet on the floor were not too cold, but it was a bit embarrassing. Frank and I were at most nominally husband and wife. Wearing matching pajamas felt oddly embarrassing. As I pushed Frank towards the bed, he frowned and kept urging me on. Only when I had helped him onto the bed did he glance at my feet on the cold floor and commented that it was chilly, so, obediently, I climbed onto the bed. Despite his disability and somewhat indifferent demeanor, he was still considerate and sensitive. That night, I suddenly remembered falling into Frank's warm and firm embrace earlier today. With that thought, I couldn't fall asleep anymore. Meanwhile, Frank beside me slept soundly, possibly due to the alcohol. As he was sleeping deeply and even muttered in his sleep, Sarah, actually that card, has no money. He had fallen asleep again within a second after finishing his sentence, and there I was, clutching the bank card he had stuffed into my hand earlier today, finding sleep even more elusive. When I woke up in the early morning, the space beside me was empty. I thought it was already late in the morning, but when I opened the curtains, it was still dim and gray outside. Glancing at the wall clock, it was just after 5 a.m. Yawning, I shuffled in my slippers to the bathroom. I thought about going back to bed for a bit more sleep, but I was somewhat worried about Frank. His mobility was limited. Where could he have gone so early in the morning? So, I wrapped myself in my robe and left the bedroom. The hallway nightlight was on, casting a dim glow. I walked to the stairwell and peeked down. The living room on the first floor was also empty. I figured Frank must have gone out for some reason. Just as I was about to head back to the bedroom, I suddenly heard Frank's voice. His voice was low and cool, and although he spoke, I couldn't make out the words clearly. Looking in the direction of the sound, it seemed to be coming from a room on the side of the first floor corridor. I knew I shouldn't have been curious, and it would have been wiser to turn a deaf ear, but inexplicably, I found myself quietly descending the stairs and heading towards it. At the doorway of the room, I held my breath and stood to one side, peering through the slightly ajar door to observe the scene inside. What I saw took me by surprise. There sat Frank, who usually seemed indifferent and uninterested in worldly matters, now seemingly transformed into someone else, draped in a loose black silk robe. He sat in a chair, his expression cold, his eyes sharp and fierce, more intense than even Francis's. 1 minute to explain everything, Frank said casually, leaning back and lighting a cigarette. As I shifted my gaze, I noticed, aside from a few black-clad bodyguards standing around Frank, there was also a man kneeling on the floor in front of him. The kneeling man had his back to me, his face obscured, After Frank finished speaking, the man's body stiffened noticeably. Yet he remained silent. Frank, too, stopped talking and just watched him, cigarette in hand. From my angle, I could clearly see Frank's face and the chilling sharpness in his eyes. After a few days of acquaintance, I had only just realized how oppressive Frank's presence could be. Lost in thought, Frank suddenly raised his voice, apparently reminding the kneeling man to confess honestly. Startled by his tone, my hand trembled, inadvertently pushing the door open slightly. The door was now half open. Frank and I slowly made eye contact, leaning back in his chair with a fierce aura. The atmosphere was awkward and tense. I gathered my courage to address Frank. I woke up and didn't see you, got a bit worried, so I came down to check. If you're alright, then I'll head back upstairs. After speaking, I turned to leave. Wait, it was Frank's voice. He spoke softly, no longer in his usual casual tone, but with a composed voice. Those two short words carried an icy firmness. Taking a deep breath, I turned back around. I then saw Frank's gaze fixed on my feet, his brows slightly furrowed. Following his gaze, I realized I was barefoot on the floor. Oh, for the sake of eavesdropping more conveniently, I had left my shoes at the stairway entrance and walked here barefoot. I had been too nervous to even notice the cold. Frank motioned to an assistant beside him, who immediately understood and pushed a wheelchair over, helping Frank to sit in it. Frank moved in front of me, his eyes still cold. It made me feel slightly uneasy. Frank, I tried to speak, uttering just the name before stopping myself. What should I call him at such a moment? Calling him young Master Frank seemed too distant. Calling him just Frank, it seemed we weren't on familiar enough terms to address him by his first name. As I hesitated, Frank made the first move. He suddenly grasped my wrist, pulling me with a slight force, and I fell into his embrace, sitting on his lap as he sat in the wheelchair. My heart was pounding erratically, not out of shyness, but nervousness. This person already had a disability in his legs. Would my sitting make it worse? In a hurry, I tried to stand up using the armrests of the wheelchair, but accidentally pressed a button, and the wheelchair slowly started moving towards the wall in front of me. Luckily, Frank managed to stop the wheelchair in time. He frowned, pressed me back down, and said sternly, "Sit properly." His tone was so cold that it scared me a bit. So I obediently did as I was told. That's how Frank ended up holding me in his embrace, maneuvering the wheelchair as we ascended the stairs together. The villa had an elevator, so there was no need to worry about Frank navigating the stairs. Like that, I stiffly returned to my room, afraid to move too much lest I hurt him. By the time we reached the bed, my face was burning up. If it weren't so inconvenient at the moment, I would have called my mom and told her to stop believing in rumors. Who said that Frank, with his leg conditions, wasn't humane? The wheelchair stopped by the bed, and I hurriedly got down and sat on the edge. "Shall I help you onto the bed?" I asked, blushing and speaking softly. Frank massaged his temples and said, "No need, I'll sit for a while." Then he added quietly, "It's still early, let's sleep a bit more." Okay, having just witnessed Frank handling matters, I dared not disobey him now. So I obediently followed his instructions. Indeed, it was still early. And soon, drowsiness overcame me. As my consciousness began to blur, it seemed someone got into bed and lay down beside me. Instinctively, I wrapped my arms around the person's waist and entwined my legs with his. At home, I used to sleep hugging a giant teddy bear, always using my arms and legs. In a daze, the person I embraced seemed to stiffen. When I woke up, the sunlight was already shining on my bottom. I opened my eyes and inadvertently met a pair of deep, dark eyes. Looking down, it was Frank. He was still wearing that black pajama set, though for some reason, 2 buttons at the collar were undone, revealing his exquisite collarbones. Forcing myself to look away, I realized I was holding Frank in a very intimate position, my arms tightly wrapped around his waist, my legs curled around his, like an octopus ensnaring its prey. Upon meeting his gaze again, my heart panicked, and I suddenly let go. "Sorry, I'm just used to it." However, my explanation seemed to have the opposite effect. The man, who had been indifferent until now, furrowed his brows and his tone turned colder. "Used to holding who?" I paused, then truthfully replied, "A life-sized plush bear." Frank was silent for a couple of seconds, then his lips curved in what seemed like a smile. "All right, I'll have my assistant buy you a new one." True to his word, We had barely started breakfast when his assistant walked in with 2 bodyguards, each dragging 2 life-sized teddy bears, one of each color. Frank glanced at them. He casually asked, "Which one do you like?" "Put it on the bed." I swallowed the pastry in my mouth. "Then, the gray one." Actually, I didn't dare say the rest. The gray one, it looked a bit like Frank. It should be very comforting to hold. When breakfast was almost over, Frank's phone suddenly rang on the table. He glanced at it, and his expression suddenly turned cold, out of curiosity. I also took a quick peek. The screen flashed with a name, Francis. Frank didn't seem in a hurry to answer. Only when the call was about to disconnect did he leisurely wipe his hands and pick up. Too lazy to hold the phone, Frank had it on speaker. However, once Francis began to speak, I was stunned. Their conversation, devoid of any pleasantries, got straight to the point. "I need a translator on my side. Can I borrow someone? I heard Miss Sarah studied German in college. How about I borrow her for a day?" The soy milk I was just sipping almost sprayed out. "Borrow me for a day? That can't be right. The vast Smith family can't find a temporary emergency translator. I suspect that the lack of a translator is just a pretext for something else." After swallowing the soy milk, I turned to look at Frank. Although we were married by agreement, I still held the reputation as the second lady of the Smith family. It seemed inappropriate to be borrowed by his brother as a translator. However, Frank was silent for just 2 seconds before agreeing. He was decisive. Simply saying okay, then hung up without even asking where or what preparations were needed. 2 minutes later, Frank's phone vibrated. At that moment, he was leisurely eating his steak, medium rare, his knife and fork parting the flesh, revealing a hint of red, quite an appetite for early in the morning. It wasn't until his plate was empty that Frank picked up his phone. I sneakily glanced over. It seemed to be from Francis, with details about the time and place. After breakfast, Frank accompanied me to the company. I was somewhat surprised. Rumor had it that even before Frank's legs were injured, he was a reckless spendthrift who rarely visited the company, indulging only in pleasures. I had assumed he would have the driver take me there. On the way, Frank was as reticent as ever. Just before getting out of the car, he turned to me and asked, "It might involve some technical terms. Are you confident?" Although I wanted to boast in front of the client, the Smith family's business deals were worth billions. This was no joking matter, so I honestly shook my head. "No." I thought Frank would say he'd find a professional translator now, but he just closed his eyes and rested. It was still an air of calm. Frank and I had just reached the meeting room when Francis and the foreign party also entered. I hurriedly stood up, cautiously greeting them. What followed went exceptionally smoothly. However, the person ensuring the smoothness wasn't me but the reputedly frivolous and unlearned Frank. When he was in school, despite my consistently low grades and average German skills, which I haven't used professionally since graduation, I can still manage a fluent conversation, which is quite an achievement for me. However, when it comes to specific professional jargon related to their industry, I still find myself at a loss for words. At such times, Frank, who always maintains a cool detachment, would timely intervene. His tone remains mild but his pronunciation is impeccable. Towards the end of our meeting, the foreign client from the other party mostly bypassed Francis and me, choosing instead to speak directly with Frank. The business deal went smoothly, and the client promptly agreed and signed the contract. It was a project worth hundreds of millions, and Frank handled it with such casual finesse. From where I sat, I could see Frank's profile clearly, seated in his wheelchair. His legs might be disabled, but his posture was upright, exuding an indifferent yet noble demeanor that commanded respect. At first sight, this man seemed straightforward enough. His disability and grounded demeanor made him seem approachable, but the more I interacted with him, the more I realized there was something extraordinary about him. Francis's harshness and aggressiveness were overt, almost intimidating, but Frank was different. He appeared nonchalant, a facade that drew everyone's attention, yet the more you delved, the more he seemed like a mist of mystery, inscrutable and unpredictable. After signing the contract, Francis invited the client to dine, but the invitation was politely declined. As we left the meeting room, we bumped into Wendy at the door. She was carrying a delicately made insulated food container, walking towards us. I quietly observed her from behind the group. It was clear at a glance that she was carrying homemade soup. Indeed, even the fiancés of the wealthy personally prepare and deliver homemade dishes to the office. just as I was pondering this. Wendy slipped on something. It was Frank who steadied her, seated in his wheelchair. He leaned forward forcefully, almost falling himself, but managed to catch her just in time. Interestingly, Francis, her fiancé, didn't even make a move to help. I silently watched this unfold. Frank's hand firmly grasped Wendy's wrist, then suddenly let go as if it were too hot to hold. Really, all of this was none of my business. But inexplicably, I felt a tightness in my chest. As we escorted the client to the elevator, he smiled and said to me, "You must be Mr. Smith's fiancé. You did a great job translating." "Thank you." I paused, then realized that by Mr. Smith, he meant Francis. It seemed there was a misunderstanding. I was about to clarify, but Francis spoke up. "Thank you. Here comes the elevator. We look forward to a pleasant collaboration." He didn't bother to correct the misunderstanding. Moreover, Francis spoke in German throughout our conversation. Francis had not spoken German, leading me to believe he didn't understand it, yet it turned out he was pretending to be ignorant. I was more perplexed and somewhat suffocated. The suffocation stemmed from Frank, who also didn't speak up to clarify. He clearly understood German. After the clients left, Wendy handed a thermos to Francis, telling him it contained ginseng chicken soup she had been cooking all morning. "Thank you," Francis responded flatly, and casually passed it to his assistant who was standing by. Throughout the entire time, he never once opened the thermos to look inside. After sealing the deal, Francis suggested that the four of us should go out for a meal. As expected, Frank agreed. The two brothers seemed to have a strained relationship, full of conflicts, yet it appeared they hadn't completely fallen out. A new high-end private kitchen had recently opened near the office, and Francis's assistant immediately called to make a reservation. This restaurant was exceptionally well regarded, and even someone as wealthy as Francis couldn't secure a private room, so we chose a quiet corner of the restaurant. The food was slow to arrive, but the flavors fully justified the wait. I was thoroughly impressed by the chef's skills and ate with great focus. However, while eating ribs, some sauce dripped down, and as I hurriedly wiped it with a napkin, my gaze inadvertently shifted under the table. There was Wendy, Francis's fiancée, and by name Frank's future sister-in-law, but in reality, his first love. She was subtly brushing Frank's trouser leg with her high heel. I froze for a moment, then discreetly withdrew my gaze. I glanced sideways at Frank, who was peeling shrimp, his expression serious. He seemed completely oblivious to Wendy's flirtation. Actually, I really wanted to remind her that Frank had a disability in his legs. Even if she secretly poked his legs with needles under the table, he probably wouldn't feel it. I inadvertently became privy to this drama, but couldn't show it, which was incredibly frustrating. I just kept sipping my soup. Just as I put down my spoon, several shrimps appeared on the plate in front of me. The shells were neatly peeled and arranged. I looked up. They were the ones Frank had just peeled. He had been diligently peeling shrimp, apparently for me. I glanced at Frank and then unintentionally at Wendy across the table, feeling surprisingly flattered. I quietly thanked him. Just as I was about to eat the shrimp, Frank suddenly put down his chopsticks in irritation, pushed me to the bathroom. I paused for a moment, then realized he was talking to me. I set down the shrimp and obediently complied. Okay, although I didn't understand why he needed me to push him when his wheelchair was electrically operated. I pushed him to the entrance of the men's restroom. Frank entered alone, and I waited for him in the corridor. The corridor window was open, a breeze blew in, and I felt the urge to smoke. Unfortunately, I hadn't brought any cigarettes today. I paced back and forth in the corridor, a bit agitated. Suddenly, a voice came from behind. "Want a smoke?" I turned around in surprise, only to find it was Francis again. Does this man have a connection with restrooms? It seemed like every time I saw him, it was near a restroom. Francis took out a cigarette from his pocket, raised an eyebrow slightly, and offered it to me. I hesitated for a moment but couldn't resist taking it. After lighting the cigarette, I had just taken a puff then I heard Francis beside me ask, "Do you think Frank has a thing for my fiancée?" Cough, cough. His words caught me off guard, and I choked on the smoke, coughing uncontrollably. "No, not really," after catching my breath. I quickly denied it. "You must be overthinking it. Frank is married. How could he possibly harbor feelings for his future sister-in-law?" This was a question I dared not answer carelessly, even though I also sensed that Frank might have those intentions. I couldn't say it out loud. Startled, I raised my hand to take another drag of my cigarette, but suddenly, Francis snatched the cigarette from my hand. He took a puff, then pinched it out with his fingertips. Then he cornered me between himself and the wall, leaning close enough that his warm breath brushed my face as he spoke. Sarah, since your marriage is just a contractual agreement anyway, how about the four of us swap partners? Insane, his words echoed in my ears, leaving my mind blank, repeating only that single term. Either I was going mad, or Francis had lost his senses. Did he even realize what he was suggesting? I swallowed hard, unable to speak, because in a flash, I remembered what I had just seen under the table, Wendy's foot gently stroking Frank's leg. So, it wasn't my imagination, Frank's fondness for her. Could there actually be something between them? I have a habit of getting distracted when I think too much. As I was lost in thought, suddenly I heard Frank's voice from an angle. Sarah. He uttered my name in a cold tone. His voice was like a tangible chill, climbing up my spine, making me shiver instantly. My hand trembled, and I pushed Francis away slightly. At the restroom door, Frank sat in his wheelchair, giving us a cold look, his frown laden with anger. I saw his fingers tensing on the armrest, veins bulging on the back of his hand. He was furious. I rushed to explain, but before I could take a step forward, my wrist was grasped tightly. With just a slight effort, Francis pulled me back to his side. This man was incredibly bold, or perhaps utterly fearless. Ignoring my resistance, he pressed down on my shoulder, laughing as he looked at Frank. Aren't you enjoying Wendy's flirtations? How about we swap? Francis's grip was so strong, the more I tried to break free, the tighter his hold became. My shoulder hurt so much I almost wondered if he was crushing my bones. I looked at Frank, shaking my head. Frank. Before I could finish, he approached us. Frank still sat in his wheelchair, now stopping right in front of us. He sat, while Francis stood. Despite Francis's physically superior position, Frank's presence was undeniably commanding. He nodded slightly, locking eyes with Francis for 2 seconds before suddenly grabbing his collar. With a single pull, Francis was forced to bend over. For a moment, the head of the Smith family appeared somewhat distressed. Francis. He clutched the other person's collar tightly, his back rigid as he said, "There's no need to send your fiancé to test me anymore. My leg is done for. And one more thing," Frank said coldly. Pausing for 2 seconds before suddenly smiling, he abruptly let go, even taking the opportunity to smooth out the wrinkles on Francis's crumpled collar with a few pats, neither too gently nor too harshly. "From now on, save those unnecessary tests. They're meaningless. If I really wanted to fight for this so-called heir position, you probably wouldn't be sitting so comfortably," Frank concluded, withdrawing his gaze and leading me away. I breathed a sigh of relief and hurried to follow him. Just as we were about to turn the corner, I suddenly heard Francis's low chuckle from behind. "Frank, I knew it. You're far more interesting than I thought." I thought to myself that the thinking of these two brothers really isn't like that of ordinary people. Francis, having just been warned by his younger brother by the collar, not only wasn't angry but seemed somewhat excited. Truly a family of oddballs, of course, having just been caught by Frank in a somewhat ambiguous pose with Francis. I felt a bit guilty and dared not talk too much, just following closely behind Frank. He headed straight out of the restaurant. I wanted to help him by pushing his wheelchair as a gesture of goodwill. However, just as I approached him from behind, he suddenly sped up his wheelchair. I missed and stood there dumbfounded for a couple of seconds. Quite the tsundere. I could only continue to follow behind Frank. At the car, the driver helped him in, and just as I was about to follow, the car door closed. Through the car window, I could only vaguely see his silhouette inside. "Frank," I called out to him instinctively, but the driver got into the car immediately. The black Rolls-Royce sped past me. Seriously, I stared dumbfounded at the tail of the car, cursing Frank in my mind for not even giving me a chance to explain. "So, it looks like I might have to take a taxi home again today." Of course, I've learned my lesson and certainly won't make the foolish move of chasing one car with another. I flagged down a taxi at the roadside, and about 5 minutes passed. I didn't catch a taxi, but I did stop Frank's Rolls-Royce. The car that sped away 5 minutes ago had now circled back and stopped in front of me. The window rolled down, revealing Frank's expressionless profile. I was unsure of his mood and didn't know what to say for a moment. After about 10 seconds, Frank slowly turned his head. "Not getting in." I am, Seeing the opportunity he gave, I quickly climbed in, however. Once inside, Frank still kept a stern face, not saying a word. The atmosphere in the car was oppressively somber. The driver in the front seat didn't even dare to breathe too loudly, fearing he might upset the gentleman in the back. I really wanted to break the ice, but after sneaking a few glances at him, I didn't dare. In the silence, the car finally stopped in Frank's villa garage. I breathed a sigh of relief, quickly got out of the car without waiting for the driver, and voluntarily helped Frank into his wheelchair. Just as I was about to push the wheelchair, he accelerated with an electric boost. He left again without saying a word. It's really headache-inducing. We've only been married for a few days, and today is the first time I've had to stay alone in this empty house. After returning to the villa, Frank told me to go to my room and then he disappeared somewhere. I was somewhat restless, worried about Frank's mood. After all, he's the wealthy backer in this arrangement. If he gets upset, I'm the one who suffers. Deciding to look for him, I went downstairs for a walk, but I didn't see any sign of Frank. Frank likes his peace and doesn't like others invading his personal space. So the villa is cleaned by housekeepers at scheduled times. By evening, the vast villa felt eerily empty and somewhat frightening. After wandering around, I hurriedly returned to my room, still in my slippers. Frank never came back. Just then, my mother sent me a message. I replied to her messages half-heartedly while curled up under my blanket, feeling increasingly sleepy. I was almost asleep when suddenly the blanket over my head was yanked away. I nearly screamed. But in the moonlight shining through the window, I recognized the face in front of me. It was Frank. His hands firmly restrained me as he planted quick, alcohol-laced kisses on me, on my eyebrows, my eyelids, on my lips. He freed one hand to tightly grasp my chin and kissed me fiercely. I was so shocked that I couldn't even react. His kiss was forceful and assertive. "Sarah," he murmured my name, his hand moving from my chin to caress my face. "I wanted to take things slow with you. But why won't you behave?" I really wanted to say that I had been behaving, and it was his brother who deliberately stirred up trouble, making Frank witness what appeared to be a moment of intimacy between us. But I couldn't voice any of this. He silenced me with his kisses. Frank didn't even give me a chance to explain. He leaned over me, propped up by the bed, his eyes gleaming under the moonlight. "Sarah," he said, his drunkenness fading, seeming to regain some of his senses, his voice hoarse. He asked, "Do you know why, out of everyone, I chose you to marry, even just as a trophy wife?" I shook my head. Honestly, I didn't know why such good fortune had befallen me, to marry without selling my body or soul, to be a trophy wife and gain millions. Many girls would break their necks for such a deal. Why did it fall to me? Frank was silent for a long moment, and I couldn't help pushing against his chest, whispering, "Why?" Frank's gaze swept over my face, lingering on my lips. He pursed his lips, his Adam's apple subtly moving. The atmosphere suddenly turned tense. I held my breath, watching him, my heartbeat speeding up. I waited for Frank to speak, but all he said was, "I'll tell you later." I gathered my courage to protest, but just as I moved, the strap of my loosely worn nightgown suddenly slipped. Frank's gaze followed. In that moment, his eyes paused. It was as intense as reality itself. Suddenly, I pushed him away and pulled up my shoulder strap. I stuttered because I was nervous. "It's getting late, let's go to sleep." Upon hearing this, Frank chuckled. "Is that an invitation?" I shook my head, blushing, about to speak, but he cut me off. "Sarah, I've been drinking." I swallowed hard. "So," he freed one hand and unbuttoned two buttons on his shirt, a hint of desire coloring his eyes. "So, it's hard to control myself." Although he said this, he just smiled and didn't go any further. About half a minute later, he turned and lay down beside me. His legs limped throughout. The strength was all in Frank's arms. I felt a pang of sympathy. So his legs were truly useless. I used to wonder if it was all an act, like a feigned disability to deceive others. After Frank lay down, there was silence for a while. Just when I thought he was about to fall asleep, a low voice came from beside me. "I have a money-making opportunity for you. Interested?" His voice, usually deep and pleasant, was now hoarse. "Yes, yes, yes." I propped myself up on the bed and eagerly asked what the opportunity was. He turned to look at me. "Getting a marriage license." A marriage license? I was a bit stunned. Wasn't our wedding just a formality, a sham marriage, and now it needed to be legalized? I hesitated for a moment and asked cautiously, "Is there a time limit?" Frank was silent for a few seconds. 3 years, 10 million. He seemed unsure as he asked. I grabbed his hand. Deal, afraid he might change his mind. I even set an alarm for early the next morning, planning to be at the Civil Affairs office as soon as it opened, but after calming down, I couldn't help but ask him why. Frank closed his eyes, his voice returning to its usual indifference, less curiosity about the financier's affairs. "Frank and I got our marriage certificate. However, I blame my lack of caution and my too great trust in Frank's financial capabilities." After receiving the marriage certificate, Frank handed me a piece of paper. I thought it was a check, but when I unfolded it, it was an IOU, clear in black and white. It stated Frank owed Sarah 10 million, to be repaid within 3 years. I clenched the IOU, cursing inwardly. This handsome, crippled man, helpless, his face was too good-looking that even in my extreme anger, I couldn't bear to utter a harsh word. I stared at the IOU for a long time, then silently put it away. Later, while Frank was resting with his eyes closed in the car, I secretly took a photo of the IOU with my phone, blurred it, and went online to consult. "Does this IOU have legal validity?" The lawyer hadn't replied, but Frank next to me spoke up. "Stop searching. Within 3 years, it will all be yours. Let's talk about that later." Frank opened his eyes and looked at me with a mix of frustration and disappointment. "We're already married. Isn't all the money in my bank account essentially yours now?" My eyes lit up. That made sense. I quickly turned off my phone and modestly asked him for his bank card PIN. Frank threw his wallet at me. It contained 4 or 5 bank cards. He rubbed his forehead and said in a nonchalant tone, "The PINs are all your birthday. I've recently changed them." I unapologetically took the bank cards. Even if there weren't 10 million in Mr. Frank's account, there must be at least a few million. Now that we were married and he had mentioned it, I might as well treat it as marital property. Frank is not what he seems. Later, I couldn't sit still and found an excuse to have Frank drop me off at a nearby mall. I told him I was going shopping, but quietly headed to the bank after he left. The balance of the 5 bank cards combined was less than 1 million. I now seriously wondered, could Frank be Mr. Smith's illegitimate son? But even for an illegitimate child, this was too meager by the Smith family standards. Staring at the bank balance, I was on the verge of tears when suddenly Frank called. He said, Mr. Smith had returned and wanted to meet me. My legs went weak. Before marrying Frank, I might not have heard much about Frank or Francis, but Mr. Smith's reputation was well known. Mr. Smith, originally named Carl Smith, started as a celebrated writer before switching to business. His first venture was a resounding success. His business grew larger over time, making him the most famous entrepreneur in the city. Mr. Smith was now older, but in his youth, he was known in the business world for his decisive and ruthless actions. I had seen news about Mr. Smith before. Even a few minutes of interview footage was enough to send a chill down my spine due to the fierceness in his eyes. After mentally reviewing all I knew about Mr. Smith, I almost cried. "Do I have to go?" On the other end, Frank casually replied, "What do you think?" I guessed it was not optional. Frank seemed to be trying to reassure me. "Don't worry, the old man is very kind." Kind, that word made me want to cry even more, but no matter how scared, I had to face it. I mustered my courage and bought a decent dress at the mall to change into. Just after leaving the mall, I saw Frank's car parked by the roadside. After getting into the car, I nervously fiddled with the hem of my dress and asked him if Mr. Smith's residence was far from here. I had heard that Mr. Smith liked to live alone and rarely stayed at the Smith family estate I had visited last time. "It's all right," Frank said indifferently, expecting at least a 20-minute drive based on his response. I was surprised when the car stopped in less than 3 minutes, to be precise. I got into the car in front of the mall, and after a short drive, we turned into a nearby residential area. Despite being close to a commercial hub, the villa area was spacious enough to isolate its residents from the outside world. The community was very quiet and the environment was impeccable. I had seen this community online before. The cost was astonishingly high, the land worth its weight in gold. I hadn't even started preparing when the time arrived. I became even more nervous, fidgeting with the hem of my dress and taking deep breaths. I finally got out of the car with Frank. I followed behind Frank, dutifully pushing his wheelchair even though he didn't really need my help. Entering the gate, The courtyard was spacious and only adorned with some flowers and plants. Moving further inside, the vast living room was still empty. I breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps Mr. Smith had just stepped out. Just as I thought that, suddenly, footsteps came from the direction of the kitchen. Seconds later, an elderly man with a spatula appeared at the doorway. His hair had grayed somewhat, but his eyes still sparkled with vitality, and a black apron was tied around his waist. His face slowly merged with the memory of the man from an interview, whose eyes and brows had once been stern and cold. However, the man rumored to be as fearsome as the king of hell now wore a smile, his voice booming. "Frank, I made your favorite sweet and sour fish," he said as he approached, offering the spatula to Frank. "Want to taste the sauce?" Frank frowned and pushed the spatula away. At the same time, he suddenly grabbed my wrist and pulled me, who stood there dumbfounded, closer. "This is your daughter-in-law, Sarah." My heart raced to my throat. "Smith," I stuttered, initially calling him Smith, but feeling it was inappropriate, I awkwardly corrected. "Dad, help." Who could have imagined that the fearsome Mr. Smith, rumored to be ruthless, would be like this in private? The hastily prepared greetings didn't even get a chance to be spoken. Mr. Smith, holding the spatula in one hand, grasped my hand with the other, his laughter hearty. "Good, good." He then let go of my hand, picked up 2 boxes from the nearby coffee table, and handed them to me as a meeting gift. One of the boxes was particularly large. Unable to refuse, I nervously accepted it. It was incredibly heavy. "This thing must weigh several pounds." Mr. Smith invited me to sit on the sofa, then turned back to the kitchen, mentioning he would prepare some of his best dishes for us to try. With that, he returned to the kitchen, still smiling. I was somewhat in shock. Mr. Smith, the man whose mere foot stomp could make the entire business district tremble, was unexpectedly warm and friendly. Frank turned to look at me, his expression serene. "I told you, he's very kind, and he loves to cook various dishes for me." I was at a loss for words, because my attention was drawn back to the box Mr. Smith had given me. Upon opening it, it almost blinded me. Shimmering gold, all gold bars. I swallowed hard. This meeting gift was indeed lavish and unique. Meanwhile, Frank poured me a cup of tea, his tone casual. "This is just the appetizer. Open that smaller box." I obediently did as told, opening another box, this one containing a bracelet. Having a usual interest in jade, I stared at the jade bracelet in front of me, feeling my throat dry up. Frank was right. Compared to this, those gold bars really were just an appetizer. After a glance, I carefully closed the lid. Normally, I wouldn't feel guilty about extorting money from Frank, but this gift from Mr. Smith really made my heart race. After much hesitation and despite my fear, I decided to go to the kitchen to lend a hand. Unexpectedly, Mr. Smith didn't send me away. On the contrary, we surprisingly enjoyed each other's company. Mr. Smith was down to earth in private. He led the cooking, and I assisted, our cooperation surprisingly smooth. Moreover, Mr. Smith truly was a man of many talents, skilled in literature and business, and even cooking. Once the dishes were done, the house was filled with delicious aromas. The 3 of us, with Mr. Smith, enjoyed 6 dishes and a soup, all home-style favorites. Mr. Smith invited us to sit and dine, and he kept reminding me to relax, telling me that today he was just an ordinary father, not Mr. Smith. After a few times, I really did begin to relax. Mr. Smith's affection for Frank was clearly overflowing. The Mr. Smith known for his decisive actions in business was busy at the dinner table, picking bones from the fish and peeling shrimp for Frank. "Son, eat more fish. See if Dad's cooking has gotten worse." "Frank, I encountered something really interesting abroad last month. Want to hear about it?" Frank, however, hardly paid him any attention. He always had that indifferent expression, eating whatever Mr. Smith served him, and only occasionally nodding in response. Seeing Mr. Smith's doting father behavior across the table, I finally believed what Frank had said to Francis that day. He had said that if he wanted the successor position, it wouldn't be Francis's turn. At the time, it seemed like Frank was just being arrogant, but now it seemed to be true. As I was thinking, Mr. Smith, as if he had read my mind, also brought up the topic. He sighed deeply, looking worried. "Frank, when do you actually plan to take over my position?" Mr. Smith showed a mix of helplessness and indulgence when facing his own son, but Frank seemed to dislike the topic, and as soon as Mr. Smith brought it up, He put down his chopsticks and wheeled himself to the bathroom. With Frank gone, I felt awkward continuing to eat, so I just put down my chopsticks and pretended to calmly sip some tea. However, before I could swallow the tea, Mr. Smith's expression across the table changed. His previously amiable demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold gaze, his eyes sharp as blades, pressing in on me. Mr. Smith gripped his teacup, his fingertips rubbing against the surface, and he slowly began, "Frank may not know why you're getting close to him, but I do." I stared at Mr. Smith, replaying all my interactions with Frank in my mind. Thinking that of course, it was all for money, and Frank knew this from the start. I thought Mr. Smith's next question would be how much money it would take for me to leave Frank. However, I was wrong. He looked at me sharply, his gaze cold. Then he asked, "What on earth is your mother planning to do?" I was startled. "What does this have to do with my mom?" Mr. Smith looked at me for a long while, under his scrutinizing gaze. I felt a chill down my spine, and I broke out in a cold sweat. It seemed like ages before Mr. Smith finally looked away, furrowing then relaxing his brows. He sighed after a moment. "She really didn't tell you anything, did she?" I was somewhat dumbfounded. "So, what was my mom supposed to have told me?" Unable to contain my curiosity, I cautiously asked him. I hadn't expected Mr. Smith to share, but surprisingly, he briefly revealed a long-buried significant piece of gossip. My mom was once Mr. Smith's girlfriend, though we call him Mr. Smith. He isn't really that old. Mr. Smith is under 70 this year, nearly 20 years older than my mom, but he was a charming and wealthy man in his youth. Despite the age gap, my mom had once passionately loved him. However, she was tragically betrayed later and discovered that he was already married. Because of Mr. Smith's betrayal, she remained alone and unable to have children for life. When she left, she took her revenge on Mr. Smith. She couldn't have children, and how did I come into the picture? I was adopted from an orphanage. I've known this since I was young. I was utterly shocked by this series of revelations, unable to close my mouth, wanting to speak but then falling silent. What was there to say? It seemed inappropriate to say anything. While I was silent, Frank happened to return. For some reason, his presence in his wheelchair by my side gave me a bit more confidence. I felt much more at ease. He glanced at me and asked indifferently, "Why aren't you eating?" Before I could respond, he answered his own question, "Not to your taste." He then looked up at Mr. Smith. "You should practice your cooking skills." As I looked up, Mr. Smith had already reverted to his amiable face, nodding and smiling in agreement. He even immediately made a phone call, asking his assistant to buy some cookbooks and have them delivered within half an hour. He was eager to learn. Frank, however, was less accommodating. He put down his chopsticks and took me away without looking back. Behind us, Mr. Smith kept on talking, mostly about wanting Frank to visit him more often. He said he was very lonely, but Frank never turned back. Frank took me to a hot pot restaurant. He mentioned that last time I had expressed a desire to try hot pot. Amidst the swirling steam, I found myself lost in thought, replaying the secrets Mr. Smith had just shared with me. It never crossed my mind that my mother and Carl Smith, a renowned figure in the business world, shared such a legendary past. As I was deep in thought, a hand appeared in my field of vision. It had long, well-defined knuckles and was quite striking. The hand passed me a bowl of dipping sauce prepared just the way I like it, with sesame paste. Frank looked at me, his eyebrows slightly raised. "Something on your mind?" he asked. I nodded, then shook my head. I couldn't carelessly talk about what Mr. Smith had told me, but Frank seemed to have guessed it. He sipped his tea and said calmly, "He told you everything." It was a statement of fact. While I was still distracted, Frank signaled the waiter to replace our tea with alcohol. As he poured the drinks, he looked up at me, his lips curling into a slight smile, as if he found it amusing. "Mr. Smith wasn't entirely honest with you. There are things he definitely didn't tell you," Frank said, passing me a glass of wine. "Want to hear it?" I took the glass and nodded honestly. Yes. Frank was easy to talk to and open about secrets. We continued to eat 3 plates of meat rolls and drank 5 bottles of beer as he filled in the details of the tumultuous love and hate between Mr. Smith and my mother. The gist of it was the same. Mr. Smith, who was known for his lack of depth in relationships, had my mother completely wrapped around his finger. Just as she was overjoyed to be pregnant with his child, he pulled away, leaving her a substantial sum to end things. Only then did my mother discover he was already married. Stubborn as she was, My mother refused to have an abortion and wanted to keep the baby, but given Mr. Smith's nature, how could he allow her to use the child as leverage against him in the future? So, he engineered an accident. My mother was involved in a car accident that caused her to lose the child. Accidents, however, are hard to control, and my mother was severely injured, resulting in the removal of her uterus, robbing her of the ability to have children ever again. Moreover, Mr. Smith briefly mentioned how he wronged my mother but said nothing about how she got her revenge. His son ended up telling that part. My mother was fierce. After that, she was depressed for a long time, constantly crying, and even attempted suicide a few times. After being saved from suicide, it seemed as though she was reborn, no longer sullen, but rather, she sought out Mr. Smith again. She approached him without holding any grudges, tears streaming down her face. And they became passionately entangled once more. My mother was always a charming woman, otherwise, she wouldn't have held Mr. Smith's attention for so long. Even he, experienced and cunning as he was, fell into her trap. But during one of their intimate moments, my mother, from nowhere, pulled out scissors she had prepared in advance and castrated him. From then on, the once charismatic Mr. Smith could no longer charm anyone. Fortunately, his wife had also given birth to a child for him, leaving behind an heir at last. Unfortunately, this child was spoiled beyond reason and died from drowning in a river at the age of 17 while playing carelessly during a trip to the countryside. Mr. Smith, usually stoic and tough, was brought to tears several times by this tragedy. Later on, Mr. Smith adopted Francis and began a worldwide search for Frank, a son he had fathered during his younger, more carefree days. Eventually, Frank was found and brought back to the Smith family. However, Frank despised his status as an illegitimate son and forbade Mr. Smith from revealing his true identity, allowing only that he be introduced as a newly adopted son. As Mr. Smith grew older, his former bravado faded. In public, he maintained his imposing presence, but behind closed doors, he doted on Frank, his only surviving offspring, agreeing with everything he said, always with a smile. This included when Frank proposed marrying me. Mr. Smith, with his resources, could easily have discovered my background, yet he couldn't deny his beloved son anything. Frank insisted that Mr. Smith not attend our wedding. As I finished the story, my heart was still racing. It was truly thrilling. I took a large gulp of ice-cold beer, feeling the chill spread down my throat, and all I could think to say was how amazing my mother was to have handled a tough, influential business tycoon rumored to be ruthless. No wonder Mr. Smith was still visibly shaken when my mother was mentioned. Even after all these years, if I were in his shoes, I'd be even more emotional. After a satisfying meal, Frank paid the bill and took me home. I followed him, pushing his wheelchair, wanting to ask him something but eventually holding back. The ride home was silent. We went upstairs upon arriving home and entered the bedroom in unspoken agreement. I helped him into bed and sat down on the other side. After a long silence, I couldn't help but voice my confusion. So, did you know who I was from the beginning? Frank turned to look at me, his dark pupils inscrutable. He nodded. Yes. Did you marry me on purpose? Yes. I bit my lip, asking softly, to get back at your dad. It was clear that Frank harbored resentment towards Carl Smith, even though Mr. Smith now treated him like a cherished son and went out of his way to please him. Unexpectedly, Frank shook his head. No, he looked into my eyes. I deliberately tricked you into a marriage of convenience, but not to upset him. Why then? I was puzzled. Other than that, I couldn't understand what would make Frank intentionally marry me under a pretense, despite his disability. His good looks and status attracted many women. More beautiful girls than me would willingly approach him. So, why me? Frank looked down at me. He gave me an answer that was almost no answer at all. Because I wanted to marry you but was afraid of scaring you off. So I used the marriage of convenience as an excuse. I was stunned by his response. For a long time, I couldn't snap back to reality. Wasn't our first meeting on the wedding day? I asked. Frank stared at me for a while, his slender fingers pinching the bridge of his nose, sighing helplessly. So, you really never recognized me? I was completely confused. What should I have recognized about him? He is the second son of the Smith family, while I'm just a child from an ordinary family, adopted at that. If it weren't for this arranged marriage, we would have been people from two different worlds. Clouds and mud, impossible to mix. Frank gestured for me to come closer. Come here. He was physically challenged. So I obediently moved closer and sat beside him. Frank lifted his hand and gently placed it on my head, rubbing it softly. Sarah, I told you before, I am Carl Smith's illegitimate son from his younger days. Do you know where I grew up? He asked. I shook my head. He spoke slowly, emphasizing each word. In an orphanage, the JX orphanage. My body stiffened, and I carefully scrutinized Frank's facial features, trying hard to match the face in front of me with someone from my deep memories. There seemed to be a resemblance, but I couldn't believe it. I think I guessed who he was. I pointed at him, then at myself, trying to speak, but my throat suddenly went hoarse, and I couldn't make a sound. Frank's hand, resting on the tips of my hair, gently caressed them. He began to speak. His voice was also somewhat choked up. It seems you still remember me, and my tears instantly started to fall. Of course, I remembered. Back then, he wasn't called Frank, he was Simon. And I wasn't called Sarah either. I was abandoned at birth, nameless, until the matron named me Lucky. I was a wild child who grew up in the orphanage, but he originally had a mother, yet she abandoned him. He was picked up and brought to the orphanage when he was just 6 years old. The little boy in my memories had a beautiful face but was exceptionally thin and pale, clearly malnourished despite growing up with his biological mother before being abandoned. Back then, he was fragile, sensitive, frail, and timid. His thin little frame seemed as if it would scatter with a mere breeze. Thus, as the new kid in the orphanage, he was bullied by the other children until I couldn't stand it anymore and intervened, fighting off a group of boys to save him. I had always been the leader among the kids, but saving him meant I had to fight those troublemakers more than once. After several fierce fights that hurt the bullies but exhausted me even more, they finally got scared and stopped picking on Frank. After that, Frank became my little sidekick. Even when I went to the bathroom, he would squat by the door to keep guard. At night, he had to stealthily hold my hand while sleeping in the bed next to mine. Only then could he sleep peacefully. He was a child with an extreme lack of security. At least, back then, he was under my careful guidance. My little sidekick Frank transformed from a frail lamb into a young wolf cub. He grew taller and put on some weight, his youthful face becoming more attractive, and, at some point, the timid and fragile boy turned into the toughest fighter in the orphanage. Anyone who dared to speak ill of me would face his clenched fists, his posture threatening as if ready to devour them. Over time, we became untouchable in the orphanage, ignored by everyone else. I felt a bit lonely, but Frank seemed to enjoy the peace. It seemed that just being by my side every day was enough for him. But the good times didn't last. There came a time when I noticed a change in Frank. He became distracted, jumpy, and even started to shun my touch. At first, I was angry, but then I inadvertently discovered the truth. It was the headmistress, the middle-aged woman, who appeared kind and gentle, was a pedophile. Frank, with his delicate features and pale complexion, had naturally become her new target. One night, Frank ran away from the orphanage. We didn't even get a chance to say a word to each other. After that, I never saw him again. Over the years, I often thought of him. I assumed that Frank was probably no longer alive. In those bleak times, how could a sensitive and intense 6-year-old boy, who had fled the orphanage, survive? I always thought about the other boys in the orphanage, perhaps like Simon back then, pale, fragile, desperately lacking in security. Yet sometimes, I felt disheartened thinking there might never be another boy as beautiful as him, whose unformed features still dazzled those who saw him, so dazzling that years later, now an adult, when I think back to that boy, I still remember those deer-like eyes. As an adult, I became extremely money-driven. All the money I earned, I donated to orphanages. Not to the one I had been in, though. The headmistress of that place had accidentally killed a boy, which led to the uncovering and investigation of her crimes, and she was sent to prison. All these events happened after I left the orphanage. Pulling myself from these memories, I leaned against the headboard and quietly listened to Frank recounting his story after he left. He said that after escaping the orphanage, he ended up on the streets, yet he dared not stray too far. He was afraid that if he went too far, he might never see me again. He would often sneak back to try and see me, lurking by the gate in the night, but he never dared to meet me, fearing that I would be implicated if discovered and also scared that once he saw me, he wouldn't have the heart to leave again. Until later, when I was adopted, the person who adopted me is now my mom. After my adoption, Frank quietly followed and watched over me for a while. My mom was incredibly good to me, pouring all her thoughts and emotions into raising me. I had a happy life. She never dated anyone, dedicating herself entirely to bringing me up alone. This reassured Frank enough to leave. I was 7 years old when I left the orphanage and was taken home by my mom, and I grew up surrounded by love ever since. My mom lived passionately. She had a clear sense of love and hate, was materialistic and vain. Yet she was willing to spend $3 on bread for me and $1 on water when she only had $5, donating the remaining dollar to a beggar on the street. She was extraordinarily beautiful and loved wearing bright red dresses that few could pull off. Her life was like a fiercely blooming red rose, dazzlingly red. Now, I understand that when she married me off to Frank, she might have had other motives, but I don't hate her, truly. Without her, there would be no Sarah today. The night was calm, and Frank's voice was deep and pleasant as he continued his story, though he briefly glossed over the more difficult details. He didn't want to dwell on the awkward and painful memories, and I didn't press him. He said that later, when he was wandering and struggling, his mother found him. He hadn't cried in a long time, but he was moved to tears, thinking she had come to take him home, but instead, she took him to buy new clothes and treated him to a delicious meal. Then she took him to the Smith family, to confront Mr. Smith and demand recognition. Though she spoke of wanting recognition, she knew it was unlikely. She was really there to ask for money. However, she overestimated Frank's importance to Carl Smith and underestimated his ruthlessness. Carl Smith, not one to be manipulated, had someone orchestrate an accident for Frank's mother after dismissing them, just as he had with my own mother. Frank saved her, but that incident left him with a lifelong disability, having damaged his legs. Yet, he couldn't save her completely. He lost his mother before he could even reconnect with her maternal love. He resented his mother and hated Carl Smith even more. Despite being his own flesh and blood, Carl Smith sent him to a private hospital for careful treatment and deposited a large sum of money into his account, enough for a lavish lifetime. Yet, even with all his wealth, he couldn't heal Frank's legs. Frank eventually left, using that initial capital to carve out a niche for himself in the underground business world from his wheelchair. When he spoke of these past events, his brow furrowed slightly, and a flash of fierceness in his eyes reminded me of the fierce young boy he once was. A few seconds later, Frank quickly composed himself and continued his story. He mentioned that a few years ago, Carl Smith's beloved legitimate son died in an accident. After mourning dramatically and realizing he had no heirs left, in his grief, he remembered he had an illegitimate son still out there. Using all his connections, Carl Smith found him. Unfortunately, Frank refused to acknowledge his lineage or allow Carl Smith to reveal their relationship to anyone. Carl Smith agreed, fully aware of Frank's resentment towards him, yet he still cautiously tried to please and make amends. Despite years of hardship and indifference, Carl Smith knew Frank was close to his mother and still hired someone to orchestrate that accident. To be honest, Carl Smith never really cared about whether Frank lived or died. He didn't intend to kill him. But if Frank had died in that accident, Carl Smith wouldn't have been upset. Later on, when Mr. Smith wanted to find a wife for Frank, my mother took the initiative to approach him. She offered to arrange a marriage for him. Smiling, the bride was to be me. Frank agreed immediately. My mother asked for a dowry of $10 million, and Frank didn't hesitate at all. Then, 10 minutes before the wedding, what was supposed to be a bonding session turned out to be our first formal meeting after many years. Reflecting on everything now, I suddenly understand those gentle moments with Frank back then. For instance, at a Smith family banquet, I casually mentioned liking some pastries, and when leaving, he actually packed some for me. When I sneaked downstairs barefoot to eavesdrop, he didn't scold me but pulled me onto his lap, worried my feet might get cold. When Frances tried to flirt with me, the murderous fury in Frank's eyes. It turns out, it wasn't all an act. That night, Frank brought out some wine. We drank a lot and talked a lot. Eventually, we both drank too much. In the lonely night, with intoxicating wine and two people opening their hearts, it's easy for something to happen, like him kissing my lips, or me, trembling, closing my eyes, and responding, "The rumors are false. Frank isn't impotent." Although some rumors suggested his leg condition was feigned, unfortunately, that rumor is also false. Frank truly has a problem with his legs. But, during an intimate moment, he whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, my legs can still be treated." He said he wouldn't have married me if he wasn't sure his legs could be treated. I wanted to shake my head and say it didn't matter, that I could accept him no matter what, but he silenced me with a kiss, and I couldn't speak. Tonight, the moonlight is exceptionally gentle, and so is Frank, having uncovered the past. Frank and I moved from a so-called contractual marriage to being a real husband and wife. The wedding was done, and the certificate was obtained. Now, we even have the reality of a married couple, truly, indistinguishably, a married couple. After that night, Frank seemed like a changed man. In front of others, he remained aloof and cool, but when it was just the two of us, he became like his old self again. A few days later, it happened to be Mr. Smith's birthday. This time, the banquet was not comparable to the previous family gathering. 2 days before the banquet, Mr. Smith cautiously called Frank, asking if he would attend. On this end, Frank nonchalantly listened, then turned to look at me. Seeing me nod, he then agreed. On my birthday, Frank held my hand as we attended the event together. The banquet was held at a hotel owned by the Smith family, and the grand hall could almost accommodate 1,000 people. As soon as Frank appeared at the entrance of the hall, Mr. Smith, the elder of the Smith family, came forward to greet him. However, he was only halfway there when he was overwhelmed by Frank's indifferent gaze, stopped in his tracks, gave an awkward chuckle, and did not come any closer. The crowd watched with some confusion but didn't think much of it. After all, in everyone's eyes, Frank was just an unloved, disabled adopted son. Fiona, on the other hand, came over again. She approached Frank with a smile, but her eyes betrayed her resentment and affection. What an awkward woman. She was in love with Frank, yet she insisted on putting on airs, mocking him with a face full of arrogance. It seemed that by doing this, she no longer appeared as the pitiful one who loved in vain. Fiona's mockery didn't even receive a glance from Frank until she turned her sarcasm towards me. Fiona ridiculed the dress I wore today, insinuating in a bizarre tone that I was out of touch. I didn't take it to heart, but the temperature around us seemed to drop suddenly. I turned my head. Indeed, Frank's expression had turned icy. In front of many guests, he stood up for me, glanced at Fiona, and comforted me in a calm voice. It's fine. Everyone has their own definition of being in touch. Perhaps in her view, being in touch means having a thick waist and a short neck. Meanwhile, Fiona touched her own neck, both angry and embarrassed, almost bursting into tears on the spot. She didn't dare to cause a scene, but Francis came over in time, supporting Fiona under the guise of maintaining harmony. He scolded with a stern face, using his status as the elder brother, criticizing that it was Mr. Smith's birthday and it was embarrassing for the Smith siblings to cause such a scene, which could be laughable to others. While he was speaking, Frank rubbed his brow, clearly impatient. Are you done? Saying so, Frank took my hand and led me straight to the center of the banquet hall. There, Mr. Smith, surrounded like a celebrity, had his eyes fixed on his son. It was indeed quite poignant. Carl Smith was ruthless in his youth, harsh with strangers and those close to him alike. Yet, even if he was cold-blooded in his younger days, as he aged, his heart softened. Having experienced the extremes of power and wealth, he now sought the simple joys of family affection. Like any ordinary elderly person, he yearned for the simple happiness of being surrounded by loving children in his twilight years. Such a pity, his wife had died, he was disabled, and his legitimate eldest son had died in an accident. The only bloodline he had left hated him and was turned into a cripple by his own actions. For him now, this was probably more painful than bankruptcy, but who could say he didn't deserve it? Following his usual habit, Frank led me to a quiet place with fewer people. Seeing Wendy not far away, I suddenly felt a twinge of jealousy. I tugged at Frank's sleeve and asked softly if he had ever liked Wendy. Frank paused in surprise. He turned to look at me, his expression unusually serious. Who told you that? No one told me. I just guessed it myself. I then described a recent family dinner where I noticed Frank was constantly looking at Wendy. Frank laughed. No, he took a sip from his wine glass. To me, she's like a sister without blood ties. When I was struggling outside, she helped me a lot, and later, it was because of me that she met Francis. At this point, Frank sighed. Last time, I just felt sad seeing her with Francis, feeling sorry for her. I've always felt guilty, as Francis doesn't really care for her, and I feel like I pushed her into a difficult situation. But, I paused. Recalling the intensity in Frank's eyes when he looked at Wendy, Frank was amused by my thoughts. He gently tousled my hair, his tone affectionate. Where did you get the idea of intensity? You're letting your imagination get the better of you. It's just regret seeing someone who has been kind to you, like a real sister, being dragged into a tough situation and suffering by Francis's side. I breathed a sigh of relief but could understand Frank's feelings, due to his past experiences. Frank was someone who appeared cold but was warm-hearted inside. He always remembered those who had helped him and likewise, those who had hurt him. Still puzzled, I suggested, you just need to reveal your true identity and warn Francis to treat Wendy better. He surely wouldn't dare to disobey. Frank shook his head. Matters of the heart can't be controlled by force. Mutual affection is essential. I feel that she's entrusted her heart to the wrong person, but ultimately, it's her own choice. And I won't interfere. I listened intently and nodded in agreement. Frank really had a clear understanding of life. While I was silent, Frank suddenly tugged on my sleeve. I looked down to see him grabbing my wrist. With a slight force, I was compelled to bend down. Frank looked up at me, his eyes intense. Our gaze didn't last more than 3 seconds before he quietly moved his throat and kissed me on the lips. The touch was warm. He then let go, and I stood up, stunned. Not even understanding why he had suddenly kissed me. Remember that, he spoke softly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. The way I just looked at you, that could be called intense. The way I look at others, is not. I blushed, surprised that he cared about this detail. As our moment intensified, elsewhere, during the birthday banquet, Mr. Smith took the opportunity to make an announcement. Adopted son, Frank, was his biological son. The banquet hall fell silent for a few seconds. Then erupted in chaos. Everyone in town knew that Carl Smith had no sons, and his only biological son had died in an accident. The Smith family had only 3 adopted children, and Frank, who was disabled, was the least favored among them. Everyone had been certain that Francis would be the heir to the Smith family, but now, Frank had transformed, suddenly revealed as Mr. Smith's biological son, which unsettled many in the room over the past few years. Everyone has been eager to curry favor with Francis, often at the expense of his brother Frank, especially during the gatherings where both adopted sons were present. Unexpectedly, everyone had bet on the wrong horse. Just when I thought the birthday party had reached its peak, the atmosphere thickened as my mother made her high-profile entrance. She was meticulously dressed, adorned in a strikingly bright red dress. Her long wavy hair and fiery red lips complemented the bold outfit on her. The intense red didn't seem garish at all. Instead, it accentuated her charm to the fullest. Approaching 50, the years had left their mark on her face, yet they seemed only to add to her allure. She approached me, her gaze briefly sweeping over my hand clasped with Frank's, her smile deepening. Without speaking to me, she walked straight up to Carl Smith. They locked eyes. I thought Carl Smith would explode with rage, but he didn't. He just quietly observed her and said, "You've come." It seemed her arrival was expected. The high-profile business gala, triggered by my mother's arrival, ended abruptly. Mr. Smith and she went upstairs together. What they discussed remained a mystery to everyone, including Frank and me. The next day, I received a call from the police station. My mother had been arrested. She had turned herself in. According to her confession, she had committed a murder years ago. Her victim was Carl Smith's biological son, the young heir of the Smith family who never lived past 18. That year, the 17-year-old lived a life pampered and adored, behaving arrogantly and capriciously. Carl Smith, having lost his fertility, doted excessively on his only son, fulfilling every desire with almost extravagant provision. That spoiled young man, at 17, went behind Carl Smith's back to the countryside for fun, overly excited by a landscape he had never experienced. That night in the countryside, he encountered a young girl. When force failed, he knocked her unconscious with a stone, but her mother arrived in time, accidentally pushing him into the river in the ensuing struggle. And I was that young girl. I was knocked unconscious that night and woke up back home in the city. My mother, with a calm expression, told me she arrived just in time to chase the brood away. To me, that was the end of the matter, but I didn't know that she had killed someone that night, nor that the victim was the son of the fearsome business magnate, Carl Smith. It seemed a tragic fate. He deceived her, caused her to become hopeless about love, led to her losing a child, and a hysterectomy, leaving her unable to bear children ever again, and in return, She ended his legacy, and by a twist of fate, killed his son. After all the twists and turns, perhaps only the term, tragic fate, could aptly describe it, I rushed to the police station, wanting to see her. However, the police told me, my mother, she didn't want to see me. After several unsuccessful attempts, I had no choice but to return home. I asked Frank to hire the best lawyer for me, but unfortunately, my mother didn't live to see that day. She hadn't even been sentenced when she passed away in the detention center. It wasn't suicide. The detention facility was strictly managed. She had no opportunity to take her own life. She died from a sudden cancer attack. Only then did I learn that she was already in the late stages of lung cancer. It was too late for any treatment to be effective. I had only recently discovered her secret and hadn't even had the chance to ask her about it when this series of events overwhelmed me. If it weren't for Frank, I might not have been able to cope. Frank, as my son-in-law, took charge of everything personally. At the funeral, I stared blankly at my mother's black and white portrait. Although the photo was devoid of color, looking at her face always involuntarily brought to mind a red dress. Her presence seemed inherently vibrant. Such a vivid person had now turned to gray. After the funeral, I returned home. I intended to visit my mother's bedroom but unexpectedly found a letter she had left for me. It turned out everything was part of her plan. Before she died, she wanted to see me married to the right person, the person who met me briefly in childhood, whom I hadn't seen for years, but who had thought of me constantly over those years, the person who, despite his physical disabilities, was exceptionally capable and could protect me thoroughly. Before she died, she wanted to meet Carl Smith one last time, to see once more the man she had loved and hated her entire life. In the letter, she wrote that she had wanted to live a brilliant life. But she had met Carl Smith. When they met, she was just over 20, in the prime of her life. He was already mature and composed, effortlessly trapping her within his grasp. Later, their love and resentment entangled them for a lifetime. In the letter, my mother recounted an incident from the past. She arrived just in time when I was nearly undressed by someone. Had she been a moment later, my innocence would have been lost. In her anger, she confronted the man and accidentally pushed him into the river. He couldn't swim and struggled in the water. My mother initially intended to save him, but by the moonlight, she recognized his face. The scoundrel trying to molest her daughter was Carl Smith's son. Indeed, enemies often cross each other's paths. That night, my mother stood by the river for a long time, conflicted and hesitant, but ultimately, she did not go into the water. She let the lust-driven boy slowly sink to the river's bottom. In the latter part of the letter, she told me she chose to marry me off to Frank because she had investigated and found out that Frank had been with me in the orphanage and they got along well. She also knew of Frank's years of silent observation and protection. That's why she entrusted me to him. As for using me to seek revenge on Carl Smith, she never considered it. My mother's handwriting was as free-spirited and casual as she was. Her personality spilling over several pages of the letter, and I could almost hear her voice through her words. In the letter, she wrote about her lifelong love and resentment with Carl Smith. She couldn't even distinguish who owed whom more, so she didn't need to use me for revenge. She just wanted me to be happy. Even if the person who could make me happy was Carl Smith's son, she didn't care about these things. She said, "Grudges and grievances are ultimately fleeting. Those are matters for our generation, and they have nothing to do with me and Frank." The last piece of letter paper was mostly empty, with only one sentence written on it, and it was this sentence that made me, who had always been tense, suddenly break down. Her handwriting was sloppy and casual, but this sentence was clear in every stroke. She wrote, "I could never have children. Thank you for being my child." I clenched the letter, tears falling heavily. The one who should be saying thanks is me. I was abandoned at birth, and I'm grateful to her for raising me despite knowing we had no blood relation. Before I was born, I chose a mother in heaven. I chose the wrong person and was innocently abandoned. It was she who brought me home 7 years later, correcting the mistake I made back then. Along with the letter, there was also a bank card. The pin was my birthday. Inside was her savings over the years, as well as the bride price originally given by Frank, untouched. She had been saving it all for me. Coincidentally, on the 7th anniversary of my mother's death, Mr. Smith passed away. He died in his sleep, discovered by a housemaid, already gone. Upon hearing this news, Frank was very silent. He silently hung up the phone, silently went to see Mr. Smith for the last time. Finally, he silently conducted the funeral. Mr. Smith had been prepared. He had left a will with his lawyer long ago, leaving all his estate to Frank, Francis, and Fiona. Besides the reputation as Mr. Smith's adopted children, received not a penny, this action was indeed very much in line with Carl Smith's way of life, a businessman who prioritizes profit over relationships, not just over relationships, but he was particularly ruthless. He was the epitome of self-interest, always selfish, and even in death, he wouldn't leave a thing to his adopted children. Not even a symbolic portion. Therefore, at the funeral, neither Francis nor Fiona appeared. After the funeral, after the guests had left, Frank's wheelchair stopped in front of the tombstone. He looked down, quietly observing the black and white photo, and I stood beside him, silent, not knowing what to say. After a long while, a breeze blew. Frank suddenly spoke. He chuckled lowly, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Do you know why he tried so hard to please me in the last few years of his life? To make amends to you. Frank shook his head. He wanted to compensate for his own regrets. He never, ever loved me, his own son, even though later he carefully tried to please me, finding ways to make amends. It was all for himself. In his life, he had power and status. The only thing he lacked was in the realm of offspring. He had lost the ability to have more children, and his beloved son died unexpectedly. He should have ended his days in solitude. Fortunately, there was me, his illegitimate child, who provided him with some consolation. He desperately tried to please and make it up to me, just to compensate for his own shortcomings, so that his later years wouldn't seem so pitiful. Frank's smile was tinged with irony, yet, his eyes reddened slightly. He only ever loved himself. No matter how hard he tried to please, he remained pitiful. Throughout his life, he never had anyone who truly cared for him. His wife was loyal but was driven to depression by his indifference and infidelity. My mother loved him, but he ruined her life. If he had gone bankrupt, no one would have stayed to give him a second glance. He would have been utterly abandoned. Frank chuckled. How tragic. Yet, on that day, at Carl Smith's grave, Frank shed a tear. He said that tear was his farewell. It was also his way of cutting ties with all the unbearable past, all the grievances and resentments. All the hatred and complaints vanished with life and death. What remained for us was a brand new future. Our next plan was Frank's treatment. The treatment went smoothly, but there was a little surprise along the way. In our bathroom, 2 lines appeared. Mine, I was pregnant. The sudden arrival of the child disrupted our plans but also brought more hope. It seemed as if all the past hardships were paving the way for a new beginning, just like the new life growing inside me. From then on, Frank's favorite activity was holding the dictionary to pick names. Thanks to him, I dreamt of names every night. Eventually tired of it, I pressed Frank. Stop thinking, I've decided on the names. Frank looked serious. What are they? I sipped warm water, casually saying, if it's a boy, we'll call him George. If it's a girl, Grace. How does that sound? I assured myself. Such beautiful names. Frank was silent for a moment, then suddenly pulled me into his arms. His warm voice tickling my ear, his low laughter echoed. Good. He tightened his grip on my hand and said earnestly, if it's a girl, let's call her Lucky. The moon was bright. His voice was even softer than the moonlight. Let's have a daughter like the girl named Lucky in the orphanage back then, who loved wearing white dresses and had bright, crescent moon eyes when she smiled. Would that be nice? Yes. And if it's a boy, let him be like the boy from the orphanage back then. Handsome and fiercely determined like a little wolf when he fights. I lifted my head in his arms, just in time to see the moon outside the window. Many years had passed since our childhood, but the moon hanging in the night sky was still the same as it had been back then. After hearing the story above, what are your thoughts? Feel free to share your opinions in the comments section. Looking forward to hearing from you. If you liked this story, don't forget to like it, share it, and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.